It's very clear that the leader of the NDP is passionate about this issue. It's also very clear that the government has taken all of the positions and not stated in the House whether they'd support the motion. I'd ask the leader of the NDP that if the government does not support the message, is he willing to, right here, right now, declare that his confidence agreement with this government is over today? Just a yes or no.
What we're going to do is...
I am a Canadian, I am a Jew, and I am a Zionist. And 95% of Canadian Jews are Zionists.
Here is the intent of extremists in the current Israeli government. The Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, while addressing Israeli soldiers attacking Gaza, invoked the biblical story of Amalek, which basically tells to go, attack, and spare no one, and kill all men and women, infants and animals. Another extremist, the Israeli Minister of Defense, who called Palestinians human animals, stated, quote, Gaza won't return to what it was before.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Supply consideration of an opposition motion concerning Canada's action to promote peace in the Middle East. Opposition motion standing also in the name of Ms. McPherson.
Ms. McPherson, seconded by Mr. Green, moves that, given that, 1, the situation in the Middle East is devastating to many Canadians, particularly those with friends and family members in the region. 2, le bilan des morts.
2, the death toll in Gaza has surpassed 30,000, with 70% of the victims women and children.
The Hamas terrorist attacks on October 7, 2023 killed nearly 1,200 people, and over 100 hostages remain in Hamas captivity. 4, des millions d'habitants de Gaza.
4, millions of residents of Gaza are displaced and at risk of starvation, death, and disease, and Gaza is currently the most dangerous place in the world to be a child.
The United Nations reports over 70% of civilian infrastructure in Gaza, including homes, hospitals, schools, water and sanitation facilities, have been destroyed or severely damaged by Israeli military attacks. 6. Le 26 janvier 2020.
6. On January 26, 2024, the International Court of Justice ordered 6 provisional measures, including for Israel to refrain from acts under the Genocide Convention, prevent and punish the direct and public incitement to genocide, and take immediate and effective measures to ensure the provision of humanitarian assistance to civilians in Gaza.
Israelis are still at risk of attacks by Iran-backed terrorist groups, including Hamas and Hezbollah. 8. Les transferts forcés et les
8. The forcible transfer and violent attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank have significantly increased in recent months. 9. The casualties from the war on Gaza and the Hamas terrorist attack include Canadian citizens. 10. Canadian citizens remain trapped in Gaza, blocked from leaving. 11. Jewish, Muslim, Arab, and Palestinian Canadians have reported an increase in hate-motivated attacks and racism since October. 12. Palestinians and Israelis both deserve to live in peace with full enjoyment of their human rights and democratic freedoms. The House call on the government to A. Demand an immediate ceasefire and the release of all hostages. B. Suspend all trade in military goods and technology with Israel and increase efforts to stop the illegal trade of arms, including to Hamas. C. Immediately reinstate funding and ensure long-term continued funding for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, and support the independent investigation. D. Support the prosecution of all crimes and violations of international law committed in the region, and support the work of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. E. Demand unimpeded humanitarian access to Gaza. F. Ensure Canadians trapped in Gaza can reach safety in Canada and lift the arbitrary cap of 1,000 temporary resident visa applications. G. Ban extremist settlers from Canada, impose sanctions on Israeli officials who incite genocide, and maintain sanctions on Hamas leaders. advocate for an end to the decades-long occupation of Palestinian territories, and work toward a two-state solution.
I officially recognize the State of Palestine and maintain Canada's recognition of Israel's right to exist and to live in peace with its neighbours. The Honourable Member from Edmonton Strathcona.
If I must die, you must live to tell my story. Mr. Speaker, those are the words from Rifat al-Rir, who was killed in an Israeli airstrike in Gaza on December 6th. I rise today in sorrow and in hope. For 5 months, we've watched in horror as horror after horror unfold in Gaza and in Israel. The stories and the images are shocking and heartbreaking. We've seen 2 people utterly traumatized by violence, by death, and by terror. We've seen the complete failure of the international community to stop the unfolding carnage in Gaza. And we are dismayed by the failure of Canada's Liberal government to stand up for what is right, for the rule of international law, for humanity, for peace. Canadians are horrified by a brutal assault on Gaza where over 30,000 civilians have been killed. They were horrified on October 7th by the vile terrorist attack on innocent civilians in Israel by Hamas terrorists, and they are horrified now by the way Netanyahu's extremist government has responded. Canadians believe in peace and justice, not just for Palestinians or for Israelis, but for everyone. Canadians want our government to apply those values universally, regardless of the place, regardless of the situation. And I know this because hundreds of thousands of Canadians have written to me about the war in Gaza. Canadians from every province and territory, of every faith and belief, have asked us to do the right thing and help stop this war. End arms sales to Israel, push for a ceasefire and for the release of all hostages, demand that Israel stop denying humanitarian aid, and seek peace and justice for Palestinians and Israelis. But instead, this government has abdicated its responsibility, ignoring or worse, rejecting international law, tearing apart the global moral fabric that Canada has helped to construct over decades. It doesn't have to be this way. Our NDP motion today sets out specific actions that work towards peace and justice for Palestinians and Israelis. Today, the Liberals and the Conservatives have an opportunity to join the NDP and uphold the values of Canadians, to show that Palestinian lives matter as much as anyone's lives matter, that Palestinian rights are human rights, and that all children deserve justice.
I want to talk about one thing you said, which is, we are not separate. We are all part of one another. And I agree 100%. And the story, the anecdote you gave, the story you gave about him dying in the car, we all recognize that that is absolutely horrendous. But my question really regarding this motion is, I'd like to hear from you how you feel this motion will actually make a difference in alleviating the suffering of these people right now, a non-binding motion in the House of Commons in Canada. And whether you feel that you said we're not separate, whether you feel that this motion and having members vote on this will cause, Mr. Speaker, will cause greater division, not only in the House, but more importantly, among Canadians at a time where Islamophobia, anti-Semitism on the rise, and we're all very concerned about the unity. I think everyone...
All right, I know there's a number of things, and I know the honourable member realised her mistake as not coming through the chair when she was asking her question. The honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Mr. Speaker, as Canadians, we must stand for peace. We must stand for justice. We must uphold international law. What the member is suggesting is that children around the world should die, should be killed, should starve to death, and that the Canadian Parliament shouldn't act, shouldn't take steps to put things into place that would help. So it is vitally important that this Parliament sends a message that we are clear that as Canadians, we believe in the rights of all people. We believe in Palestinian human rights. We believe in Israeli human rights. We believe that the international rule of law needs to be adhered to. And we need to have the bravery and the courage to say that in this place.
Hear, 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 hear. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, on October 7th, Hamas murdered, raped, and tortured thousands. They murdered thousands of people in Israel. This motion does not hold Hamas accountable in any way, does not call for the surrender of Hamas or for the putting down of its arms or even for the return of those hostages in any meaningful way. Why is the member rewarding Hamas terrorists for their October 7th massacre in this House of Commons? She should be ashamed of herself.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Strathcona. Of order, the Honourable Member for Aurora Oak Ridges Richmond Hill.
Yes, the statement that the member made in response to my question, firstly, didn't answer my question, but secondly, she accused me.
That's... Hold on.
I rise having just returned from visiting the Middle East, where I met with my counterparts from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, Israel, and also from the Palestinian Authority. Of course, the ongoing Israel-Hamas war and the path towards peace was on the top of our agenda. These conversations were not always easy. We don't all share the same perspective, but we all share the goal of peace and stability in the region, and so we must be pragmatic and find a way forward together. While in Israel, we visited Yad Vashem, the memorial dedicated to the victims of the Holocaust, one of the world's darkest chapters. Mr. Speaker, it is important to remember that the persecution of the Jewish people did not start or end with the Holocaust. Before the creation of Israel, Jewish communities around the world struggled to find a place to call home, a place where they could feel safe, a place where they could live in security, a place where their human rights would be respected, and a place where they could live with dignity, have a family, and build a better future for their loved ones without fear. For the Jewish people, Israel is that home. Mr. Speaker, this crisis has exposed cracks and deepened the wounds of society on both sides. It is fueled by dehumanization. And when we don't see the humanity of others, injustice falls onto the shoulders of innocents. Canada will remain committed to a two-state solution, including the creation of a Palestinian state where Palestinians and Israelis live side by side in peace, security, and dignity. The long-term security of Israel, the normalization of diplomatic relations in the Arab world, and the creation of a Palestinian state cannot be considered separately or in opposition to one another. They're intertwined, and we must recognize this and act on it. And we're committed to being pragmatic and doing our part. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Merci, Monsieur.
Questions and comments.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I would like to thank the Honourable Minister for her speech today. My question is this: we are in this situation where over 13,000 children have been killed, where over 30,000 civilians have lost their lives. I know that the minister speaks to her colleagues in other countries, allies in the United States and the United Kingdom. So I have two questions for the minister at this pivotal moment in time where all Canadians are very much hoping that her government will have the moral courage to do what Canadians across the country have been asking for. So my two questions are this: has the minister reached out to leaders within the United States to push them, to urge them to do more to make sure that peace can happen in the Middle East? And will she be supporting our motion today? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank my honourable colleague for her question. and ongoing work. We don't always see eye to eye, but I know we can work together. When it comes to what is happening in the Middle East, of course, we're in close contact with different U.S. officials. I'm in contact with my colleague Tony Blinken, and I've been also in contact with many people within the White House.
Du débat, continuing debate, the honourable member for Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, despite the many positions of the Government of Canada, this motion is not about a ceasefire. This motion is about rewarding Hamas for their massacre. This motion is a vote to reward the murder, the rape, the kidnapping of Israelis, and this motion is deeply irresponsible for this Parliament. And it's hard to explain and express the complex feelings of shock and fear and anger felt by thousands across the country who are being subjected to this motion today. It would have been enough if they were shocked by the public displays of blatant anti-Semitism in our streets, driven entirely by the irresponsible rhetoric in this House. It would have been enough if they were fearful for what lies ahead in Canada. It would have been enough if they were only angry and betrayed by this government's duplicitous attempt to be all things to all people, like we just heard. But today, the blind sellout to the forces of evil at home and abroad is what should be a wake-up call like no other to every freedom-loving Canadian who has built any piece of this country and who enjoys everything that those before us had built for us. This would be a ceasefire motion if it called for Hamas to lay down its arms, to surrender, and for immediately to return every single hostage, bring them home. It is not that. In the face of some of the world's most vile anti-Semitism and in the wake of the deadliest day for the Jews since the Holocaust, this government and this Prime Minister, held captive by its NDP overlords, are giving in to terror. And this motion is only the latest example of that. Since October 7th, as Hamas launched an unprovoked and unjustified attack on innocent civilians in Israel, where hundreds of men and women, young and old, were raped, murdered, tortured, and taken hostage, more than 100 of those hostages still being held captive. This motion is not only an abandonment of the ongoing fight to bring those hostages home, it is an abandonment of our ally in Israel, and more than that, it is a blind giveaway to Hamas terrorists and those who seek to undermine democracy, freedom, the rule of law in the Middle East and in the Western world.
But I want to understand that Conservatives today are going to vote against a motion that states that this House recognize a Palestinian state, like 139 countries have already done. So let's be clear. Are the Conservatives saying that they no longer support a two-state solution? Are the Conservatives today saying that they do not support statehood for the Palestinian people? Because that is what they are saying by voting against this motion.
The honourable member for Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, it's unfortunate that that member hears that. Here's what Conservatives do support: a two-state solution negotiated by both parties in a negotiated settlement. What we don't support is this House calling on a recognition of a state whereby which is governed today by Hamas terrorists, an organization that we have called in law terrorists. We have banned them from this country. This motion rewards terrorism. This motion would never be on the table if October 7th didn't happen. And to that member, I want her to tell that to the families of the hostages, the families of the victims that are still being held hostage in Gaza today. I want her to say that to them if she'd even bother meeting them, if any of them would even bother meeting with those families.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the the President of the Treasury Board.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am a Canadian, I am a Jew, and I am a Zionist. I am proud to have been born in this country. I am proud that my family came here in the 19th century and helped build this country. My family members fought in the World War I and World War II. We are part of Canada and lucky to be so. I've represented Canada in swimming internationally. I've represented Canada as a parliamentarian. And there's no place in the world I want to be other than in Canada. The Jewish community, of which I am part, is a religious community that has existed for thousands of years, but we're also a people. And we, since we've been here in 1760, have helped build this country. We got enormous opportunities, more than we've received anywhere else in history. But we've also, in academia, in law, in medicine, in physics, in science, in sports, in journalism, We have helped build this country. And 95% of Canadian Jews are Zionists. Zionism means we believe that we have a right to have one Jewish state in our ancestral homeland. Jews are indigenous to Israel. And we have had a history where Jews have faced persecution in every country in the world. We were expelled from England in 1290. We were expelled from Spain and Portugal in the 1490s. We faced the Crusades where people were killed. We were put in ghettos throughout Europe. We faced the Holocaust. Jews were expelled from Arab lands in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And we needed one place where every Jew in the world knew if things went wrong in their country that they could go. And that is Israel, and that's what Zionism means. So when I get horrible, horrible threats and emails saying I'm a dirty Zionist instead of a dirty Jew, that's what Zionism means. So at all these demonstrations around the country outside of synagogues, and outside of Jewish schools, and outside of Jewish community centers, where people are screaming about how horrible Zionists are, well, I am a Zionist, and I'm not embarrassed or ashamed of being a Zionist. And Canadian Jews should not have to live through what we're living through right now. My community is terrified. We are being intimidated over and over by people protesting outside of Jewish buildings. Canadian Jews have no control over what happens in the state of Israel. Yet for some reason, Jewish buildings across this country are being targeted. In my own riding, at the Jewish community offices where the Jewish Public Library and the Holocaust Museum are located, demonstrators went on private property, surrounded the building, blocked access to the building, and blocked anyone from leaving for over 3 hours. This is happening all over the place. And the demonstrators, while they are perfectly allowed and right to demonstrate wherever they want, they cannot go on private property and they can't block other people from exercising their right to free speech. If I can't enter a building because I can't hear a speaker and they block me and they yell at me and they scream at me and stop me from going in, well then their rights are infringing on my rights. And police need to step in and act as police, and all leaders across this country need to tell them to do so, because this is not fair anymore. It is too much. And Jewish Canadians just don't deserve this. On campuses across this country, Jewish students have told me horrible stories from British Columbia to Newfoundland about being intimidated on campus, about walking into dormitories and having anti-Israel slogans through the walls. They walk into a building and they're asked, are you a Zionist or not? And if they're a Zionist, supposedly they're not allowed into their dorm. This is not Canada. This is not the country that I know and love, and nobody should be forced to feel this way, which is then how I get to this motion. Because the Jewish community right now is demoralized and intimidated. This motion creates one winner and one loser. Most Canadian Muslims will vastly support this motion, and they're feeling lots of pain right now in watching the events that are happening in Gaza. But Canadian Jews, if this motion is adopted, will feel tremendous pain because the way this motion is constructed, it is clearly creating a false equivalency of the state of Israel and the terrorist organization Hamas. And in the event that we want this war to end, Hamas can easily lay down arms and surrender and return the hostages and stop using citizens of Gaza as human shields. And essentially, while I appreciate my colleagues in the NDP, this motion, as some other colleagues have said, rewards Hamas. We, for generations in Canada, under successive Liberal and Conservative governments, have said that the way to recognize a Palestinian state, which we all want, living in peace side by side with Israel and in dignity and offering dignity to both peoples, should come when the two states, the two parties, negotiate their borders and the Palestinians elect a government to govern that territory. The West Bank is governed by Fatah, which has been in power without an election for 20 years. Mr. Abbas was elected in 2004. And on the other side, on Gaza, you have a terrorist organization, Hamas, that has not held elections since 2007 and is recognized by Canada as being a terrorist organization. So Hamas launched the deadliest attack on Israel, the deadliest pogrom against Jews since the Holocaust, And we're changing our foreign policy to reward Hamas and say, good for you, terrorists. You attacked a sovereign state, killed lots of people, including babies and women and everyone else, and raped and pillaged and brought people back as hostages who have now been there for almost 5 months. And yeah, let's recognize that state that we've never recognized before. What a great idea for other places in the world where terrorism ferments. Who would love this? Iran. Iran would love this because Iran is the people in the Middle East that are fermenting terrorism everywhere, whether it's Hezbollah in the north or Hamas in the south. They are supporting this, and they are loving every minute as the world tears itself apart to criticize Israel instead of focusing on Iran and its regime. And when you talk about arms sales, Mr. Speaker, let's first recognize that the American government supplies billions of dollars of arms to Israel. Canada and the Canadian government don't sell arms to Israel directly. We have provided for many years only non-lethal weapons because nobody's applied for lethal weapon permits. And these non-lethal weapons are going to a friend and ally, Israel, at a time of war. Imagine what the world would look like if all of the countries in the world, which I presume is the principle of the motion, say, we will not ship arms or even non-lethal weapons to Israel, while Hamas and Hezbollah will continue to get their weapons from Iran, through Egypt, and through Lebanon. So Israel, while it has missiles launched at it from Hezbollah in the north and Hamas in the south, will be unable to fight back and be bereft of weapons. That, Mr. Speaker, is a false equivalency that we're now making between Hamas, a terrorist organization, and Israel. And I don't think that this motion goes toward furthering anything toward peace. In fact, it's doing the opposite. It's telling our friend and ally that they're being treated in a different way than the terrorist organization, which is benefiting from weapons being shipped to it. I had the opportunity with the member from Calgary Nose Hill and the member for Eglinton Lawrence and the member for Thornhill and the member for Winnipeg. I wish I could remember the name of the riding, Charleswood, St. James, Assiniboia, Headingley, to visit Israel. And we saw the wreck of the destruction of Hamas. We visited a kibbutz where we saw buildings burned and people who had been burned to death in their safe rooms. We saw blood splattered all over the place, houses ransacked. We heard from people who had been terrorized. And you have to understand, Mr. Speaker, Israel feels that if they don't destroy the terrorist group Hamas, there will be another pogrom that kills more Israelis tomorrow or the next week or the next month. So I understand how horrible it is to see the situation in Gaza. I understand how the world looks at it with revulsion to see people dying. But we also have to understand that a democratic nation has been on many occasions attacked, war started against it, and now all sides in Israel feel they need to fight back. And so, Mr. Speaker, I stand with Israel, our democratic ally, our friend, and we, when a time of war, is when you look at countries and you say, do you stand with our ally or not? Mr. Speaker, Canada should be standing with Israel. Canada should be defending the right of Israel to fight back against a terrorist organization, and we should not be passing motions that make the terrorist organization equivalent to a democratic state. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I have to say, as a Jew, listening to my colleague across the way talk about our view as Jews as universal in terms of our position on Israel, extremely painful. Knowing that his position comes from a place of deep intergenerational trauma and the experience of genocide, including what my family went through. I acknowledge that. But I want to ask the member across the way, when he sees a child, because we know over 30,000 people in Gaza that have been murdered are women and children, does he see Hamas or does he see a child? Because what I see are fellow human beings. I don't see a Palestinian. I don't see a Jew. I see a human being. And I'm wondering if he supports peace with the purpose of stopping the murder of children. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Palestinian Canadian community deserves better than this. Humanitarian aid workers who have spent decades working to save lives in the most awful of places describe the situation in Gaza as the worst crisis they have ever seen. Take that in. These are some of the people that have worked in the most dangerous, awful places where we have seen the worst of humanity, and they're saying that this crisis is the worst that they've seen. The people of Gaza are not responsible for the actions of Hamas. New Democrats are appalled by Netanyahu's bombing of camps, hospitals, and heavily populated areas. These attacks are indiscriminate. The majority of homes in Gaza are gone, universities gone, archives gone, flour mills gone. Make no mistake, collective punishment is a violation of international law. Canada must insist that all those who broke these laws are held accountable. This includes Netanyahu's government. Canada must put pressure for the respect of the provisional measures as ordered by the International Court of Justice. Right now, Israelis are dealing with the deep trauma of the horrendous terrorist attack of October 7th, dealing with the pain and fear of hostages remaining in captivity. Israelis continue to live with the worry of being at risk of terrorist attacks, including from Iran-backed groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, terrorist groups that want the destruction of Israel, terrorist groups that are their neighbors. Both Israelis and Palestinians have the right to live in peace and security. A decades-long cycle of violence has already taken the lives of so many Palestinians and Israelis. With an extreme right-wing government in Israel and a lack of real democratic Palestinian leadership and the dangerous influence of external states like Iran, it is hard to see a path to peace. Canada and the international community must now work towards a sustainable solution where Israelis and Palestinians can live in peace and security, each exercising their right to self-determination. The solution can only be political. Our motion offers real solutions for peace and justice, steps that show that Canada can be a force of good in this world, that Canada and its leaders have the moral courage to say enough is enough. I'm also extremely worried about the impact of this crisis on people here in Canada. I've had some very important conversations with Palestinians, Muslims, and Arab Canadians. They're scared of what's happening here in Canada. They're scared of the rise of anti-Palestinian racism and Islamophobia, scared of being harassed on the streets or fired from their jobs. They feel unheard. We have also witnessed an alarming rise in anti-Semitism. Synagogues and schools have been targeted. I've heard stories from parents worried for their children if they wear their kippah or their Star of David, because to be visibly Jewish is to be at risk. Holding Jewish people collectively responsible for the actions of the state of Israel is anti-Semitism, and it is wrong. I know something of what that's like, to have your loyalty questioned because of the way you look, trying to constantly prove that you're safe, that you believe in peace, and that you want everyone to live in freedom. We must all be aware of our words and how they can be used to justify actions that we all find disgraceful. No one should feel that they're unsafe because they wear clothing that reflects their faith, because they enter a sacred space to pray, or when they exercise their right to disagree with our government or any other government. The rise of anti-Semitism, anti-Palestinian racism, and Islamophobia is extremely alarming. These problems are not new, but this crisis has made it even worse. And my message to Canadians is this, that in these dark times, we must treat each other with compassion and recognize our common humanity.
Questions et commentaires, questions and answers. The honourable member from Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, it's very clear that the leader of the NDP is passionate about this issue. It's also very clear that the government has taken all of the positions and not stated in the House whether they'd support the motion. I'd ask the leader of the NDP that if the government does not support the message, is he willing to, right here, right now, declare that his confidence agreement with this government is over today? Just a yes or no answer from him.
The honourable member from Burnaby South.
What we're going to do is continue to use the power that we have in this parliament to push for change. The way we push to double the GST rebate, the way we push to bring in pharmacare, dental care, and to make childcare legislation permanent, the same way we're using our power in this House to push for peace and justice.
The honourable member, or the honourable parliamentary secretary, the president of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, every death of any human being is a tragedy. We're getting statistics, the honourable member mentioned 30,000 from the Hamas Ministry of Health, and I don't know how accurate that is. I do know many of those people are Hamas fighters, but of course there are innocent civilians killed in wars. And we have to feel horrible for the fact that they're innocent civilians. We have to call upon Israel to exercise maximum restraint. And of course I would love to see a ceasefire, a temporary ceasefire for 6 weeks, for example, as called by the Americans. But Hamas needs to agree. We've had Hamas break previous ceasefires. We've had Hamas refuse to release the hostages. And until those hostages are released, it's very unfair to say to Israel, leave your people in tunnels under Gaza forever. And I think that's what essentially would be requested by this motion.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable for Calgary, Rocky Ridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my question to the member is, does he think that an opposition motion from a fourth party in this chamber, is that the correct way for the foreign policy of Canada to be conducted and for decisions on recognition of statehood to be made?
The honourable member from Montreal.
Mr. Speaker, absolutely not. I think, again, this motion is going to bring pain to one of two communities in Canada because one strongly wants it to pass, one strongly wants it to fail. And certainly foreign policy written this way is not a good thing. When you say that we're suddenly going to recognize the state of Palestine unilaterally when for 50 years under successive liberal and conservative governments we've said the parties need to negotiate the two-state solution and will only recognize a state when there's defined borders and a government duly elected to run that state, and you change it because a terrorist organization murders Israelis, it's a really bad precedent to set for the world. And so, of course, I agree we should not be doing that.
Commentaire, questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to ask the member if he could reflect in terms of the impact that it's having here in Canadian society, and I'm speaking specifically of racial incidents in our communities and Canadian values.
Honourable Député de Montréal.
Mr. Speaker, the war in the Middle East has torn the fabric of this country apart. We're seeing people who are passionate and emotional on both sides, who are speaking past each other often, and it's tragic to watch. But what I have to say is that the main issue that I see are the demonstrations that are crossing the line and verging on intimidation and hate speech and surrounding Jewish buildings and doing things that create fear and all kinds of intimidation for the Jewish community. It is not right, as I mentioned before, that synagogues, the Jewish community centers, that Jewish schools are the focus of these protests, or Jewish businesses for that matter. We do not control what is happening in the state of Israel as Jews in Canada, and this has to stop. It must end. Hear, hear.
Let me be very clear. I have and will continue to condemn the barbaric and inhuman acts of the terrorist group Hamas on October 7th, and I demand the immediate release of all hostages. After the October 7th horrific attacks, 3 of us from this House, the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, and I were there at the Ottawa Jewish Community Centre, standing in solidarity with Jewish Canadians and the people of Israel. We all should condemn the terrorist organization Hamas, and at the same time, we need to condemn the Israeli equivalent of Hamas. There is more in common between the extremists in the current Israeli government and Hamas. Hamas does not, they both have acted in tandem on maintaining the status quo to achieve their objectives. Hamas does not believe in a two-state solution. It wants to wipe out Israel. The extremists in the current Israeli government also don't believe in a two-state solution. They want a greater Israel, which includes West Bank and Gaza, and continue to oppress Palestinians with their apartheid policies. When it comes to its intent about Israel, Hamas has made clear its evil intent in its charter. When it comes to their intent on Palestine, here is the intent of extremists in the current Israeli government. The Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, while addressing Israeli soldiers attacking Gaza, invoked the biblical story of Amalek, which basically tells to go, attack, and spare no one, and kill all men and women, infants and animals. Another extremist, the Israeli Minister of Defense, who called Palestinians human animals, stated, quote, "Gaza won't return to what it was before. We will eliminate everything," unquote. Another extremist, the Israeli Minister of Agriculture, said, quote, "We are now actually rolling out the Gaza Nakba," unquote. These extremists in the current Israeli government have a stronger hand in terms of resources and military power compared to their equivalent Hamas. And they're using their brutal strength to achieve their genocidal objectives. On the question of genocidal intent, the strongest and the most powerful words I heard came from the Israeli-born professor at Brown University, Omer Bartov. He is a respected historian of the Holocaust and genocide. He wrote in the New York Times on November 10, 2023, quote, "My greatest concern watching the Israel-Gaza war unfold is that there is genocidal intent which can easily tip into genocidal action," unquote. Again, this is from an Israeli-born professor who is a respected historian of the Holocaust and genocide. And the genocidal intent has transformed into action. Over 31,000 Palestinians, many of them women and children, are killed by the current extremist Israeli government. Over 2/3 of the structures have been destroyed or damaged. When they use 2,000 pounds dumb bombs, possibly provided to them by their friendly Western countries, these deaths and destruction shouldn't be a surprise. Let me be clear. The extremists in the current Israeli government do not represent the people of Israel. They don't represent the vast majority of the Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis. Before entering politics, I have visited Israel twice. I have also visited Palestine after I got elected. I have good exposure to Israeli society when I was there. I have utmost respect and admiration for the majority of Israeli citizens, both Jewish and Arabs. In Canada, after being elected, several times when invited, I have attended the Israeli flag-raising ceremony at the Ottawa City Hall. During my visit to Palestine, it was not hard to notice the oppressive regime of the occupying power and the depressive nature of several generations of Palestinians in refugee camps. I am probably the only member here of both Canada-Israel Parliamentary Association and Canada-Palestine Parliamentary Friendship Group. So with utmost respect and humbleness for the safety and security of Israel and the Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis, and for the safety and dignity of Palestinian people, let us all do the right thing. Let us start with the recognition of the sovereign state of Palestine. Mr. Speaker, 139 countries across the world have recognized Palestine. I think Canada, we have to take a step forward. We change our policy, our attitude towards the Middle East in a new way through starting with the recognition of the sovereign state of Palestine.
The honourable member for Hamilton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, there's been lots of conversations in the House around trying to find balance, and in fact, the Conservatives' position has somehow tried to make this whole thing, all of the atrocities, all of the murders, all the deaths, as though it's solely Hamas's fault. So in asking for balance, not once have they acknowledged that the Hamas doesn't own F-16 fighter jets. Hamas doesn't own 2,000-pound bombs that have been dropped on civilian populations. Hamas didn't force people from the north to the south and then threaten to invade Rafah. Hamas didn't bomb schools and hospitals. So I would ask through you, Mr. Speaker, to the honourable member, in finding balance, in seeking balance from some of the ridiculous assertions from the Conservative caucus, could the honourable member please reflect on what the imbalance of power and the asymmetry of power and military might looks like in that region, and what the legacies of settler colonialism looks like here in this country?
The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's one of the reasons why, and I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for his questions, we're calling for an immediate arms embargo. Why are we providing arms to a state that's being investigated for a potential genocide?
Very much, Mr. Speaker, that I move, seconded by the MP, the member for Kingston and the Islands, that the motion be amended as follows. A, in paragraph II, by adding the word being after the word victims. B, by replacing paragraph III with the following. Hamas is a listed terrorist organization in Canada whose attacks on October 7th, 2023 killed nearly 1,200 Israelis, and that over 100 hostages remain in Hamas captivity. C, in paragraph 4, IV, by replacing the words millions of by the words 1.7 million. D, by adding after paragraph VI, 6, the following new paragraph. All states, including Israel, have a right to defend themselves, and in defending itself, Israel must respect international humanitarian law, and the price of defeating Hamas cannot be the continuous suffering of all Palestinian civilians. E, by replacing paragraph VIII, 8, by the following. The increase in extremist settler violence against Palestinians and reports of Palestinian communities being forcibly removed from their lands in the West Bank, unquote. F, by replacing paragraph A with the following. Demand an immediate ceasefire, the release of all hostages, and that Hamas must lay down its arms. By replacing B with the following. This is G, I'm sorry. By replacing paragraph B with the following. Cease the further authorization and transfer of arms exports to Israel to ensure compliance with Canada's arms export regime, and increase efforts to stop the illegal trade of arms, including to Hamas. H, by replacing paragraph C with the following. Ensure continued funding to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, to meet the dire humanitarian need, engage with the United Nations internal investigation and independent review process, and ensure implementation of necessary long-term governance reforms and accountability measures. I, in paragraph D, by deleting the words, quote, comma, and support the work of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, unquote. J, by adding after paragraph D the following new paragraph, quote, support the work of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, unquote. K, by replacing paragraph F with the following, quote, ensure Canadians trapped in Gaza can reach safety in Canada and expand access to the temporary resident visa program, unquote. L, by replacing paragraph G with the following, quote, sanction extremist settlers and maintain sanctions on Hamas leaders, unquote. M, by replacing paragraph H with the following, quote, reaffirm that settlements are illegal under international law and that settlements and settler violence are serious obstacles to a negotiated two-state solution and advocate for an end to the decades-long occupation of Palestinian territories. And, finally, N, by replacing paragraph I with the following, quote, work with international partners to actively pursue the goal of a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in the Middle East, including towards the establishment of the State of Palestine as part of a negotiated two-state solution, and maintain Canada's position that Israel has a right to exist in peace and security with its neighbors, unquote. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear. It's my duty to inform the honourable members that an amendment to an opposition motion may be moved only with the consent of the sponsor of the motion. Therefore, I will ask the member for Edmonton Strathcona if she consents to the amendment being moved.
I do consent.
So I'll wait for that. Mr. McKinnon, seconded by Mr. Garrettson. I'll get to the point of order as soon as I read this through, and then, okay. Mr. McKinnon, seconded by Mr. Garrettson, moves the following amendment. That the motion be amended as follows.
No.
A, in paragraph II by adding the word being after the word victims. B, by replacing paragraph III with the following, quote, Hamas is a listed terrorist organization in Canada whose attacks on October 7, 2023 killed nearly 1,200 Israelis, and that over 100 hostages remain in Hamas captivity, end of quote. C, in paragraph IV, by replacing the words, quote, millions of by the words, quote, 1.7 million, end quote. D, by adding paragraph VI, the following new paragraph, quote, all states, including Israel, have the right to defend themselves, and in defending itself, Israel must respect international humanitarian law, and the price of defeating Hamas cannot be continuous suffering of all Palestinian civilians, end of quote. E, by replacing paragraph VIII by the following, quote, the increase in extremist settler violence against Palestinians and the report of Palestinian communities being forcibly removed from their lands in the West Bank, end of quote. F, by replacing paragraph A with the following, quote, demand an immediate ceasefire, the release of all hostages, and that Hamas must lay down its arms, end of quote. G, by replacing paragraph B with the following, quote, cease the further authorization and transfer of arms exports to Israel to ensure compliance with Canada's arms export regime, and increase efforts to stop the illegal trade of arms, including to Hamas, end of quote. H, by replacing paragraph C with the following, quote, ensure continuing funding to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, to meet the desired humanitarian need, engage with the United Nations internal investigation and independent review process, and ensure implementation of necessary long-term governance reforms and accountability measures, end of quote. I, in paragraph D, by deleting the words, quote, comma, and support the work of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, end of quote. J, by adding after paragraph D the following new paragraph, quote, support the work of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, end of quote. K, by replacing paragraph F by the following, quote, ensure Canadians trapped in Gaza can reach safety in Canada and expand access to the temporary resident visa program, end of quote. L, by replacing paragraph G with the following, quote, sanction extremist settlers and maintain sanctions on Hamas leaders, end of quote. M, by replacing paragraph H with the following, quote, reaffirm the settlements are illegal under international law and that settlements and settler violence are serious obstacles to a negotiated two-state solution and advocate for an end to the decades-long occupation of Palestinian territories, end of quote. And N, by replacing paragraph I with the following, quote, work with international partners to actively pursue the goal of a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in the Middle East, including towards the establishment of the State of Palestine as a part of a negotiated two-state solution, and maintain Canada's position that Israel has a right to exist in peace and security with its neighbors. The motion is in order. I believe there's a point of order from the honourable member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My point of order pertains to the relevancy of this motion. I'm quoting from page 514 on Chapter 12 of Bosch and O'Brien, where it says that an amendment may not be in order if it deals with a matter foreign to the main motion, it exceeds its scope, or, Chair, if it introduces a new preposition which should properly be the subject of a substantive motion with notice. Chair, this morning the Minister of Foreign Affairs stood in this place and talked about how this motion would substantively alter Canada's foreign policy positions on matters of grave urgency to the entire world. This amendment has been dropped with, to my point of order, substantive changes to the original motion, which no member in this place has had a chance to look at or debate since it was put to the table. For example, and for your consideration, adding after paragraph 1 a new paragraph on Israel, the right to defend itself, new paragraph, adding paragraph D, support the work of the International Criminal.
I would I know that if the honourable member can summarise that. The honourable member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
Amendment M, reaffirm that settlements are illegal under international law and that settlements and settler violence are serious obstacles. Chair, all of these are major substantive amendments to the scope of the original motion. As I argue on page 541 of procedure, this materially introduces a new proposition which should properly be the subject of a substantive motion. And given that it is major public policy for Canada, peer nations are going to be watching this debate, watching this table drop at 7.
Okay, no, okay, I'm going to confer with the table just for a few moments. I appreciate the honourable member's input on that. We've been debating this at length all day long. And I do believe that the amendments as they've been presented are in order. The honourable Kingston, Frontenac Kingston.
Kingston. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The key thing here is that you cannot expand the scope to take in more subject matter than was in the original motion. And we see that there is one of the amendments proposed by the government would expand to deal with settlements on the West Bank. This is not about a motion about the West Bank, it's about Gaza. So indulging in a discussion of aspects of Israeli policy that deal with some other area, with Lebanon, with Jordan, with Egypt, with Syria, the occupation of the Golan, this is all outside of the original scope. And it's all very nice that the government would like to add it in. Perhaps it should have been in the original, but it is not. It is a separate topic, and they cannot now violate parliamentary practices based on the fact that they think this should have been included. Let them have debated this before the deputy introduced this motion, not for to change it now at the end of debate. That is well beyond the scope of the original bill. Or the original motion.
I believe on the same point of order, the honourable member for Eglinton Lawrence.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I do want to echo the sentiments that have been expressed and frustrations that have been expressed by my colleagues across the aisle. I think that what you are hearing is a concern that the very, very elaborate amendments which have just been introduced by the government House Leader have not been able to be debated. There's been no notice. This is very detailed. And in the meantime, we have an underlying motion which has been put forward by the NDP, which has been the subject of debate. And I do feel obliged to add that on behalf of my constituents in Eglinton Lawrence, that my plan was to vote against the underlying motion on the NDP for reasons that I would otherwise state, Mr. Speaker. But I would say this is a point of order that should be explored, carefully studied, and I would argue that potentially it offends members' privileges to be able to debate the very motions that we're being asked to vote on.
The Honourable Member for Longueuil-Saint-Hubert. Mr. Speaker, the Bloc Québécois, we cannot have a position on the government's amendments because there's no French version of the amendment published, and so, as it stands, we cannot study it in the first place. We hope that we'll have a translation rather rapidly, perhaps that we could take a 2-minute session pause to see how long it would take to get a French version of the proposed amendments.
Again, to echo my colleague's comment on the scope of this, including the West Bank issue, my colleague from Le Bloc is absolutely right. We are being asked to vote on a matter that is material to Canadian foreign policy, and we don't have it in both official languages?
So I'm just going to do the point of order. I just want to make sure I get the official language thing figured out. The honourable member for Mont-Royal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to echo the point of view of the honourable member for Eglinton Lawrence. This was tabled after the entire debate had concluded. How could you have such a substantive amendment that nobody has the chance to see or debate at all? It offends my privileges and the privileges of the people in Mount Royal.
We'll just take a. I'm going to take a pause for a couple of minutes until we look at this more appropriately. In respect to be able to hear from a few more people on the point of order, on the Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I understand that in the moment you might have made a ruling, as is common for chair occupants to do, before necessarily hearing arguments when that is expected to be of a routine nature. But as many chair occupants have had to deal with in the past, when parties raise substantive objections after an initial ruling, the Speaker has gone back and taken a look at that in light of the objections raised. So in that spirit, I hope that you will seriously consider the points that I am about to raise. Now, first, we should talk about how we got here, Mr. Speaker. Normally, under the motion that was adopted to guide votes in the House, there is a provision that any recorded division that is demanded is deferred until the next sitting day. So first and foremost, that would be the normal course of events. Today is the allotted day for the NDP. If that happened normally, at the end of the day, the Speaker would interrupt and the vote would be deferred until the next day. And all members would have the opportunity to study the main motion and any amendments that were received. That's not happening today for a very particular reason. And that reason is that on the sitting day prior to the 2-week constituency break, all parties agreed to not sit on the Friday after the passing of the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney, former Prime Minister of Canada, in order to facilitate the respect being given to former Prime Minister Mulroney. All parties agreed to a couple of things. First of all, the NDP agreed to have their opposition day today, Monday, instead of the Friday before that break period. In exchange for that, Conservatives agreed to a motion that would require the vote to be held at the end of the day. That was a good faith measure in order to accommodate the spirit of all MPs who were paying tribute to a deceased Prime Minister. That was granted. Now we find ourselves today in literally the 11th hour of the debate, a massive change to the motion. We're not just talking about a slight amendment to a coming into force date or tweaking a number here and there. We're talking about 14 substantive amendments to the main motion. And many of these amendments rise to the level of what I would urge you to rule is out of scope, because it rises to the level of having the same effect as defeating the motion itself. And House of Commons procedure and practice is very clear on this, that to have such a substantive amendment that it completely changes the nature of the original motion, that's out of order. Because the proper way of dealing with a motion that is unacceptable to a member of Parliament is to vote against it. If there's a small adjustment that could be made to accommodate one group or another, or one desire or another, or one perspective or another, that's one thing. And that happens all the time. There are amendments moved at committees, there's amendments moved in the floor. But to so dramatically alter the main motion, the jurisprudence on this from the Speaker is very clear, that rather than seeking to amend that motion, the proper course of action is for MPs to vote against the motion, defeat the motion, and then come back with a substantive motion that would incorporate the changes that any member was seeking. And as I go through the list, Mr. Speaker, the first one is so glaring. You know, the original motion calls on the Government of Canada to unilaterally recognize the state of Palestine. The amendment is so different that it's not just my view. I think any fair reading of the motion would say that in effect this has the effect of negating the original motion. Amendment M says, by replacing paragraph H with the following, reaffirm that settlements are illegal under international law and that settlements and settler violence are serious obstacles to a negotiated two-state solution, and advocate for an end to the decades-long occupation of Palestinian territories. That is substantially different than unilaterally recognizing the state of Palestine, including in Amendment N, which says, by replacing paragraph I with the following, work with international partners to actively pursue the goal of a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in the Middle East, including towards the establishment of the state of Palestine as part of a negotiated two-state solution. That is so different, Mr. Speaker. The original motion just says that Canada will recognize the state of Palestine. The amended motion says that it will work towards achieving that goal, work towards a negotiated two-state solution, which, by the way, is long-standing position of previous governments. That change is that is no mere grammatical or semantic change, Mr. Speaker. That is the crux of what is being debated today, a major point in the debate that has been carried all day today. So to bring that amendment in the form of a last-minute amendment to the main motion rises to the level of being so out of scope, so fundamentally altering the nature of the main motion that it should be ruled out of order. I could go on and on. There was no notice of this, Mr. Speaker. We in the opposition negotiated in good faith before the break week to accommodate the NDP supply day. We agreed to hold the vote at the end of the day. Normally, this vote would have happened tomorrow. At the very least, there should have been some kind of notice, and I believe this calls for the Speaker to rule this amendment out of order, or at the very least, to use the power of the Chair to defer the vote until tomorrow, where in so doing, all MPs would have time to absorb these massive changes and vote on it. In essence, Mr. Speaker, give members of Parliament the time that they would have had the normal course of the parliamentary calendar unfolded with supply days and deferred votes. So, Mr. Speaker, I strongly object to this motion these amendments being ruled in order. I urge you to reconsider in light of the precedents I've cited and the aspects of the amendment that contradict in such a direct way the essence of the main motion. Or at the very least, I don't want to give you an alternative to what I just suggested, because that is the main thrust of the argument, but at the very least, to use the power that the Speaker has to so order the flow of business to defer the vote until tomorrow, after which MPs will have had the time to examine exactly what is before them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, on that same point of order, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. First and foremost, I think it's important that we recognize that it was on March 1 when the House made an order indicating that we would actually be having the vote today at 7:15. That's an hour ago, Mr. Speaker. And every member before the recess understood that that vote would be taking place this evening. That's point one. The other issue that I have, Mr. Speaker, is take a look in terms of opposition days and the purpose of opposition days and the process that we've witnessed today before us. If you take a look at it, there is nothing that is not, or there is no new element that's being introduced to the motion, and I'll expand on that right away. What is important is to recognize the process that's got us to this point. The NDP introduced a motion. There's a great deal of debate on the motion. There's all sorts of crossover discussions that are taking place. And at the end of the day, the government House Leader then moved an amendment. That amendment, which is completely within scope, was accepted by the member from Edmonton Strathcona. And then, Mr. Speaker, you reread the amendment, and then after reading the amendment, you ruled that it was in fact in order. as it has been done previously on many different opposition days, Mr. Speaker. I take exception when members opposite try to give the false impression that it's out of scope. Let me give you an example, a very specific example. When they stood on the point of order to try to filibuster a vote, Mr. Speaker, ultimately, they made reference to the fact that it's the Gaza issue, a very important aspect of the amendment. Let's go to what the motion actually says about Gaza. And how can you deny that it in any way takes it out of the scope? I would refer people to VIII, the forcible transfer and violent attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank have significantly increased in recent months. So how can they say that an amendment dealing with West Bank is in fact out of scope when it's actually in the motion that's been presented? You can go further. Go to G, ban extremist settlers. Again, Mr. Speaker, how can you not identify that as also a part of Gaza? Go to H, advocate for an end to the decades-long occupation of Palestinian territories and work towards a two-state solution. Mr. Speaker, I would argue that the very premise, after you, number one, agreed that everything was in order and the vote was just about to occur, a member stands up and brings up an issue saying that it is not within the scope, when in fact it is. It's actually mentioned. And if members would have listened to the Minister of Foreign Affairs when she made her presentation to the House, or other members even make reference to both the Gaza and West Bank, Mr. Speaker, I would suggest to you not only is it within the scope, but we have an order from March 1 saying that the vote should be occurring today at 7:15. I would suggest to you that we get on with it and vote. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, we have a number of people that do want to get up on this, and I'm going to ask all of them to be very judicious and very short in their questions to the point of order that we have before us. The honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 3 points. First of all, to add to the point of order that's been made on decorum, the reality is what happened here is that on a major issue of foreign policy, the Liberals came in with a substantive amendment that changed 7 out of 9 components of the original motion, including changing the unilateral recognition of Palestine to something else, on the back of a napkin, and told the NDP what to do. Point 1. Point 2. Anybody voting by app tonight will not have had a chance to see this. So there are going to be people at home that will not have seen this. The last component is language. This is one of the most substantive amendments that's been tabled in this House on a major point of foreign policy. Our peer nations are watching this. They are going to think that this Parliament is a complete joke because the government is coming in at the end and table dropping this motion and expecting Parliament to vote on it. This sends a poor message to our peer nations, and Mr. Speaker, this should be ruled out of order.
A few more comments. Like I said, keep them very, very, very short. The honourable member for Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Speaker. And I'll just refer to Chapter 12 of our procedure book from Bosque Gagnon, the 2017 edition. And it says, an amendment is out of order procedurally if, and then the third bullet is completely contrary to the main motion and would produce the same result as the defeat of the main motion. And I draw your attention again to the original motion that said in paragraph I, which is the official recognition of the state of Palestine, to what the amendment says, which if I'll go back to the very last part of paragraph N, which says maintain Canada's position that Israel has a right to exist. Mr. Speaker, by defeating the original motion, the motion that was debated all day long in this House, and to defeat it would have our position go back to what is the official position of the government in Canada and has been for the last couple of decades. So, Mr. Speaker, I'll say again, this amendment is out of order procedurally and should be ruled that way by you as the chair.
Still, the honourable member for Simcoe North.
Mr. Speaker, I'm new in this place, but my colleague mentioned that the NDP member consented to the amendment. Now, like that has any kind of relevancy, because it's the same member who on multiple occasions says that a private member who accepts an amendment that has been ruled out of order is irrelevant in that circumstance. So he'll have to tell me how it makes sense in that case and not this one.
Okay, seeing that there are no other further comments on that, I wish it was within my power to be able to hold that vote tomorrow, because I do recognize that there is a substantive change to the motion. So some members will not have the opportunity to actually do it.
So it's a substantive piece, then it has to be out of order.
But it is not within my power, because there has been a motion in this House, so I am ordered to have the vote immediately. Unless someone would want to ask for unanimous consent to have a vote tomorrow with a specific time. The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Sure, Mr. Speaker. Given what you've just said, and after having some discussions among members of various parties, I'm sure that there will be agreement in order to allow members to do their due diligence. If we're going to take this seriously, if we're going to show Canadians in the world that foreign policy isn't done on the back of a napkin with two negotiators without any kind of consultation, is there unanimous consent to defer this vote to tomorrow?
I'm already hearing a number of votes, so or a number of no's already to delay this. Let me let me do it. An amendment must be relevant. Then we'll go to Chapter 12. This has been quoted a number of times already today. An amendment must be relevant to the motion seeks to amend. It must not stray from the main motion, but aim to refine its meaning and intent. The amendment should take the form of a motion to leave out certain words in order to add other words, leave out certain words, or insert or add other words to the main motion. An amendment should be so framed that, if agreed to, it'll leave the main motion intelligible and internally consistent. An amendment is out of order procedurally if it is irrelevant to the main motion, it raises a question substantially the same as the one the House has decided in the same session, or it conflicts with an amendment already agreed to, or if it completely is contrary to the main motion that would produce the same result as the defeat of the main motion. So I don't have a lot of procedure to go with on this one. The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
But just on that point, Mr. Speaker, you just literally referenced the point that my colleague from Selkirk Interlake and that I made myself, that when the amendment is so different, the original motion called for a unilateral recognition, the revised motion calls for a negotiated one. Those are two diametrically opposed aspects of the motion. One cannot, this is not a question of refining the main motion, this is a massively substantive change to the original motion, which rises to the level of defeating the main motion.
Or let me quote him a little more. Any part of the amendment is out of order. It originates with the mover of the main motion. The challenge we had here tonight is that we did have a motion that was substantial, one that was agreed to by the mover of the motion. So it doesn't leave me a lot of leeway to rule it out of order. So, unfortunately, it being 8:28, it is my duty to interrupt the proceedings and put forward every question necessary to dispose of the business of supply. And the question is as follows. Ms. McPherson, seconded by Mr. Green, moves that given that the situation in the Middle East is devastating to many Canadians, particularly with those friends and family. May I dispense? Didn't expect it. Particularly those with friends and families in the region. The death toll in Gaza has surpassed 30,000, with 70% of the victims women and children. The Hamas terrorist attack on October 7, 2023 killed nearly 1,200 people and over 100 hostages remain in Hamas captivity. Millions of residents of Gaza are displaced and at risk of starvation, death, and disease, and Gaza is currently the most dangerous place in the world to be a child. No, I got it. 5 or V, selon les nations.
The United Nations reports over 70% of civilian infrastructure in Gaza, including homes, hospitals, schools, water and sanitation facilities, have been destroyed or severely damaged by Israeli military attacks.
January 26, 2024, the International Court of Justice ordered 6 provisional measures, including for Israel to refrain from acts under the Genocide Convention, prevent and punish the direct and public incitement to genocide, and to take immediate and effective measures to ensure the provision of humanitarian assistance to civilians in Gaza. VII, les Israéliens.
VII Israelis are still at risk of attacks by Iran-backed terrorist groups, including Hamas and Hezbollah.
The forcible transfer and violent attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank has significantly increased in recent months. 9, IX, the casualties of the war on Gaza and the Hamas terrorist attack include Canadian citizens. X, Canadian citizens remain trapped in Gaza, blocked from leaving. XI, Jewish, Muslim, Arab, and Palestinian Canadians have reported an increase in hate-motivated attacks and racism since October. XII, les Palestiniens.
XII, Palestinians and Israelis both deserve to live in peace with full enjoyment of their human rights and democratic freedoms. The House calls on the government to demand an immediate ceasefire and the release of all hostages,
trade in military goods and technology with Israel, and increase efforts to stop illegal trade of arms, including to Hamas. C, immediately reinstate funding and ensure long-term continued funding for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, and support the independent investigation. D, d'appuyer
D, support the prosecution of all crimes and violations of international law committed in the region, and support the work of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court.
And demand
E,
humanitarian access to Gaza. F, ensure Canadians trapped in Gaza can reach safety in Canada and lift the arbitrary cap of 1,000 temporary resident visa applications. And G, d'interdire aux colons.
Ban extremist settlers from Canada, impose sanctions on Israeli officials who incite genocide, and maintain sanctions on Hamas leaders.
Advocate for the end for the decades-long occupation of Palestine territories and work towards a two-state solution. And I officially recognize the state of Palestine and maintain Canada's recognition of Israel's right to exist and live in peace with its neighbors. The amendment. A, in paragraph II, by adding the word after being the word victims. D, by replacing paragraph III with the following. Hamas is a listed terrorist organization in Canada whose attacks on October 7, 2023 killed nearly 1,200 Israelis and that over 100 hostages remain in Hamas captivity. C, in paragraph IV, by replacing the words millions of by the words 1.7 million. D, by adding after paragraph IV the following new paragraph, all states, including Israel, have the right to defend themselves, and in defending itself, Israel must respect international humanitarian law, and the price of defeated Hamas cannot be continuous suffering for all Palestinian civilians. E, by replacing paragraph VIII by the following. The increase in extremist settler violence against Palestinians and reports of Palestinian communities being forcibly removed from their lands in the West Bank. F, by replacing paragraphs A with the following. Demand an immediate ceasefire, the release of all hostages, and that Hamas must lay down its arms. G, by replacing B with the following. Cease the further authorization and transfer of arms exports to Israel to ensure the compliance with Canada's arms export regime and increase efforts to stop the illegal trade of arms, including to Hamas. H, by replacing paragraph C with the following. Ensure continued funding to the United Nations Relief and Work Agency, UNRWA, to meet the dire humanitarian need, engage with the United Nations internal investigation and independence review process, and ensure implementation of necessary long-term governance reforms and accountability measures. I, in paragraph D, by deleting words, and support the work of the International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court. J, by adding after paragraph D the following new paragraph. Support the work of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. K, by replacing F with the following. Ensure Canadians trapped in Gaza can reach safety in Canada and expand access to the temporary resident visa program. L, by replacing paragraph G with the following. Sanction extremist settlers and maintain sanctions on Hamas leaders. M, by replacing H with the following. Reaffirm the settlements are illegal under international law and that settlements and settler violence are serious obstacles to a negotiated two-state solution, and advocate for an end to the decades-long occupation of Palestinian territories. And N, by replacing paragraph I with the following. Work with international partners to actively pursue the goal of a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in the Middle East, including towards the establishment of the State of Palestine as part of a negotiated two-state solution, and maintain Canada's position that Israel has a right to exist in peace and security with its neighbors. If a member participating in person wishes that the amendment be carried or carried on division, or if a member of a recognized party participating in person wishes to request a recorded division, I would invite them to rise and indicate it to the chair. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, we request a recorded vote, please.
Accordingly, call in the members.
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings.